So, one thing that will differ between the upper and lower areas, because some are skeletal and some are smooth, striated muscle can be affected by a variety of different disorders. One of those is polymyositis, and the other one is myasthenia gravis. So, both of these diseases are going to cause difficulty swallowing, and they're going to cause weakened skeletal muscle. Myasthenia gravis is an immune disorder that physically is going to destroy acetylcholine receptors. It is almost always in females. They're not exactly sure why. Polymyositis is inflammation of the physical muscle tissue causing difficulty swallowing. Smooth muscle can be affected by two different disorders. That can cause some narrowing and hardening of tissue. Scleroderma is general hardening of connective tissue, which can even include the skin. But one of the things that's really important about your GI tract is it has to be able to stretch so that it can contract. So if you have really tough tissue, you're going to have less compliance, making swallowing painful, more difficult, and it takes a lot longer. Achalasia is the opposite of GERD. It is the narrowing of the esophagus, usually due to scar tissue. So achalasia is something that can happen after drinking nearly boiling beverages on a regular basis. It also happens when kids, or it doesn't matter who it is, like corrosive liquids are drunk. Most commonly, that is a lye containing detergent. So the reason you would lock up your chemicals for cleaning is to prevent access to lye containing detergents. If those are drunk, not only does it cause damage on the way down, but if the patient vomits it up, it causes further damage. So then you get a narrowing of the esophagus. When patients have this achalasia, they have to have a balloon dilation, usually twice a week, where they swallow an endoscopic tool with a balloon at the end, which is then inflated to dilate the space to widen it to allow swallowing. There's also newer data that shows that Botox, which essentially does what myasthenia gravis does. It works at the acetylcholine receptor to prevent acetylcholine release and then contraction. So Botox, or botulism toxin, that arrests muscle contraction so that you have relaxation, and that's been shown to help patients as well. So that was the esophagus. Now we're going on down to the stomach. And one thing you'll see here is once you swallow, if we were measuring, and in this study they did measure the tone of the muscle with swallowing. So here is the tone of the esophagus, and then when they're swallowing, you can see that the tone or contraction strength of the muscle goes up and then it goes down. It's about 6 to 8 seconds that the esophagus will have this really high tone while it's doing peristalsis. At the same time as swallowing, you'll see that your body immediately is going to prepare to receive food in the stomach. So even though the esophagus is still moving the food or liquid, the tone drops immediately in the lower esophageal sphincter, so it's less strongly contracted. And then when swallowing ends, the tone spikes for a little bit to close really tightly and prevent any reflux, and then it eventually returns to its basal or baseline tone. The proximal stomach, meaning the part closest to the esophagus, same thing. So that begins to relax right around when the body's getting prepared to swallow. And so the tone goes down and then returns to baseline. The stomach doesn't have a very strong tone when there is no food in it. It is something that can stretch without changing the pressure of the contents because of the rugae in that area. So when these esophageal waves get to the stomach, you see this nice wave of relaxation that precedes peristalsis to allow food to move without causing pain. We know that that's controlled by the myenteric plexus. Both the stomach and the lower esophageal sphincter are relaxed, and even the duodenal tone goes down to prepare for the contents. All right. So now we're moving from the esophagus into the stomach. And to get into the stomach, food has to pass through the lower esophageal sphincter. So here's what a nice healthy one looks like when viewed through an endoscopic camera. So it's closed very tightly. There's not a lot of room to get through there, but we also see that there is some redness and inflammation, and that's normal because this is protecting or the gateway to the stomach, which has a really low pH associated with it. So whenever there is acid in any area of the body, it causes inflammation, except in the stomach, hopefully. Okay, so now we'll get into motor functions of the stomach. So the esophagus we know does peristalsis. There's a whole bunch of different nerves involved in innervation in the stomach because it's a hollow organ. It's pretty much just the vagus. So we have the vagus providing the initial stimulation and acetylcholine release. And then remember, in the parasympathetic system, the ganglia is in the tissue. So here's the pre-ganglionic neuron, and here's the post-ganglionic neuron in the wall of the tissue. So there are nerves that help encourage distension so the stomach can fill and be relaxed. There's another one that's showing you distension. That's also initiated by the presence of amino acids and peptides. I mentioned that before. The longer or the more protein and fat that you have in a meal, the longer it stays in your stomach. So those things encourage the stomach to stay distended and relaxed sooner. Okay. Again, the next chapter is the secretory chapter. We learned about all these different products, and you do have to know them all. But two things that are very important in the stomach and all the GI tract to get things going. We know the vagus, is because it's parasympathetic, is an activating pathway. The local product, the local hormone that's the main activator for gastric activity is called gastrin. So gastric is stomach, gastrin is the native hormone. They name the cells that secrete it G cells, G for gastrin, so it should be easy to remember. And gastrin encourages more motor movement, more churning, more everything. So all motor activity goes up with gastrin. The other thing that gastrin increases is secretion of acid, of hydrochloric acid, by parietal cells. So motor activity goes up and chemical secretion goes up in the presence of gastrin. It's the main local hormone excitatory signal to the stomach. So you've got vagus from parasympathetic, and then you have gastrin from the G cells in the stomach themselves. So the stomach has a bunch of jobs it has to do. In this picture, we see the stomach. Again, we see this weird junction that physiologically and anatomically causes problems with GERD because the esophagus hitches in this cardial body in an area where the stomach can fill above it. And when lots of filling occurs, that encourages the tone of the lower esophageal sphincter to slack, making it more likely that food refluxes up. Okay, so cardia means body. Fundus means top generally, but it means the dome-shaped top of an organ that's furthest from the outlet. So the fundus is the top away from the outlet. The general body of the stomach, there is an angular notch, which helps form kind of like a barrier to things moving too quickly out of the stomach. The rugae allow the stomach to fill and stretch. There are just a couple of organs with rugae. The stomach is one. The bladder is another, that everybody has usually those two things. And then 1 out of 2 people have the third organ, which is the uterus. The uterus also has rugae in it, so it can stretch with a fetus or multiple fetuses. So all of these parts, they work together, and this is going to be controlled very heavily by the pylorus, which is monitored by the pyloric sphincter. That is the strong band of muscle that prevents things from leaving the stomach. And I've said this before, but remember, the pylorus is generally a little bit open unless there's food in the stomach. When there is food in the stomach, the pylorus snaps shut, and then everything gets trapped in the stomach. So the stomach can store large quantities of food. We can have about 1.5 liters in a typical stomach without vomiting. Um, we'll talk about vomiting later, but that's pretty much how much we can fit in there. Your stomach, if you've seen it in gross, it's not that big. It's a pretty small organ, but it does stretch to accommodate extra food. So it can store food, and it mixes food in a motion called churning, so that we can chemically and mechanically digest the products that are in the stomach. And once it's been digested, it is in the form of something called chyme. And chyme is like cake batter. It's smooth and it's soft, and it's easy for your intestines to extract nutrients from. And then once all of the food is mixed, again, that's usually 1 to 3 hours. The longer time components are with protein and fat. If somebody just has some celery with no fat on it, that moves through the churning process in about an hour and then moves on and empties. If it's a really high protein meal, that'll stay for 3 hours. Longer distension, you feel full longer, and then food leaves 3 hours later. And so when it's leaving, that's the emptying process. When the chyme empties, and it's very tightly controlled, so just a tiny bit of chyme leaves in each mixing or propulsatory movement. So storage component of the stomach, when food enters, it starts to form concentric circles, meaning that you've got your old food, then the newer food, then the newest food. The newest will be closer to the esophagus, and the oldest is by the outer layer. Food stretches the stomach. I keep saying this term vagal reflex. That means stretch receptors send the message that there's food in there up the vagus, and that stimulates the brain areas responsible for stimulating emptying, and then it moves down the vagus, up the vagus, down the vagus. So stomach, brainstem, stomach. And that NTS, that's where our integrating center is. The vagal reflex reduces the tone in the stomach wall so that the stomach can stretch. I said this before, about 1.5 liters is the max amount of food that you can fit in the stomach. That's called the vomiting limit. Some people have smaller stomachs, so they fit less than 1 liter. So that typically tells you when you feel full. Just a little anatomy note. If we look, so remember, the esophagus goes through the diaphragm, right? So the diaphragm would be right here. Let me see if I can just draw a little diaphragm in there so you can look at it and love it. So this is what, there, that looks nice. There's the diaphragm. So, and there's a hole in it for the esophagus to go through. When the stomach is full and presses on the diaphragm, so I mentioned when you overfill, you can get hiccups. One of the ways you can tell if the stomach is just full enough is this pressing against the diaphragm by the stomach. When you first get full, it causes you to sigh. So some people actually follow a diet called the sigh diet because you don't get the full message from the stomach to the hypothalamus that you're full for about 20 minutes after you finished eating. So the sigh indicates that the stomach is full. So if you pay attention and you feel yourself sigh while you're eating, that's your body telling you that your stomach has filled enough to touch the diaphragm, and that's the perfect time to stop. Fun. All right, so then we have mixing and propulsion. So the mixing is going to be the mechanical digestion, which helps to encourage chemical digestion also. So here's stomach after a meal. When you're in a fasting state, the stomach's just chilling. It's got its basal tone. Meal enters the stomach. It's nice and relaxed so that the bolus can come in and it's accommodating. And then once those 1 to 3 hours of breakdown happen, then peristalsis begins. I want you to notice that peristalsis doesn't start at the top of the stomach. It starts more central to the stomach. And then there's a fun little thing called retropulsion, which helps to further break down and mix food that we'll take a look at. So all of these juices are secreted by gastric glands, which we'll look at in the next lecture. These weak peristaltic mixing waves, they begin in the upper stomach, so in the halfway point, and they move in a wave down towards the antrum about every 15 to 20 seconds. So that's just your mixing. So weak mixing waves. So the stomach's just mixing and mixing. So that's beginning in the center and just contracting down, same muscle here. So longitudinal will work as a sheet, and then the circular muscle will help contract band by band by band so that we can mix things up. Then each peristaltic wave, it reaches the pylorus as well, because remember, if there's food in there, we want it closed really tightly. So this wave of contraction or excitation, that also encourages the pylorus to close really tightly. When the pylorus is closed, it's kind of like a break wall at the beach. So the waves come to the break wall and then they splash over and then they come back. So when we have these mixing movements, the food moves down, it hits the pylorus, and then it goes back in a wave. And that's called retropulsion. Retro means backwards. So it's not propulsion forward, it's retropulsion. So every time that food hits the pylorus, it goes back and then it's mixed again. So retropulsion encourages food to be really broken down. So peristaltic waves, grinding is the most vigorous type of peristalsis, and it's really close to the pylorus. And then we already said the retropulsion is every time food hits the pylorus, it goes back and then it's remixed again. All right. Again, chyme looks like paste. Food can leave the stomach, or should leave the stomach, when it resembles chyme, when it resembles this paste. So these mixing movements are going on until there are stretch and chemoreceptor messages to the brain, to the hypothalamus, to the nucleus tractus solitarius, that everything is broken down, and then you get the initiation that the stomach can finally empty. So mixing occurs until there is chyme. And chyme is the food and the gastric fluid, so the peptic acid, the hydrochloric acid. The pH is 1.5 to 3, so very low pH, very high acidity. And the chyme is mixed just by these mixing contractions of the stomach, which are just peristalsis that begins in the center of the stomach and squeezes down to the pylorus, and then the food backs back up to be remixed again. This is a fun study where they had people swallow a balloon that was attached to an endoscope, and the balloon was inflated and could receive signals from the stomach. So it was filled up with air to coat the inside of somebody's stomach, and what that person's job was to press a button whenever they felt their stomach growl or whenever they felt hungry. And that balloon recorded stretch or tone of the stomach. So here's somebody chilling in a chair, pressing a button every time their stomach made them feel hungry. So they're feeling hunger pangs, essentially. And what you see in blue are the times that the person was pressing the button, like, yep, I'm feeling pretty hungry. So you see that the tone starts to go up and up and up, and then we have a really strong contraction. So when you feel your stomach growl, that's an actual contraction of the stomach, and that stimulates hunger. So it helps you drive to look for food. It increases the drive for calories. So typical stomach contractions, so just your stomach growling, happens when your stomach's been empty for several hours. If you think about the standard American diet, breakfast, lunch, dinner, about 4 or 5 hours, your stomach is like, I would like some things in me now. And it starts to rhythmically contract like we see in this picture. Then when you have a lot of contractions, so if you've been hungry for a while, you can actually get a full tetanic contraction that are 2 to 3 minutes in length, which means like, wow, you really need to eat. And that's why kids who need to eat a lot because they have a fast metabolism and high aerobic capacity, oxidative capacity, they need to eat quite a bit. So when kids get hungry, their blood sugar goes low, like everybody's does, but the lower your blood sugar, the stronger these contractions are. And individuals who are young, like under 12, they have strong muscle to begin with in their stomach, but they have the strongest hunger contractions. So when kids say like, I'm hungry, they're really hungry. Then, so that's just your stomach growling. So those are hunger contractions. Then there's actual hunger pangs. So hunger pang is actual pain that you have when you've been fasting for quite a bit of time. So that usually begins 12 to 24 hours after the last meal, and the greatest intensity is 3 to 4 days after eating. So it's intense pain caused by really strong contractions and high tonicity in the stomach to drive caloric seeking. Okay, so the stomach has contractions to mix, it has contractions to move things. So here we have stomach emptying. So it's not much different than the typical mixing or churning movements. We have the center portion of the stomach contract, circular muscle, again contraction, then dilation in front of it. So that contracts down, mixing the food, and during the mixing or grinding, the pylorus is closed. When there is a signal that the chyme is ready to go, that is when the pyloric valve starts to loosen or dilate. And it dilates just enough so about 6 milliliters of chyme leave the stomach and go into the duodenum to try to prevent any really large shifts in pH or electrolyte balance. All right, so the emptying motion is again just peristalsis, our contraction dilation down from the center of the stomach towards the pylorus. And in emptying the pylorus, remember the strongest contractions right down by the pylorus. We call that the pyloric pump because it helps to pump things out a little bit at a time to the duodenum. So usually stomach contractions are weak and for mixing, so those are run by the myenteric plexus. 20% of the time they're really strong and they move the same fashion, mid-stomach down, ring-like constrictions, and then the more food that's being emptied, so the more empty your stomach is, the constrictions or contractions start further up the stomach. So kind of like when you're almost done with toothpaste and you have to start at the very bottom and then squeeze all the way out. As the stomach empties, the peristaltic waves start further up the stomach. Normal tone, each wave has 7 mils of chyme into the duodenum, and that's pretty much what your body can handle. Here is what a scope took of the pyloric sphincter, the place that controls emptying. That looks really great. We can see tons of mucus there as part of the protective barrier. And here is this little opening you would see typically in the pylorus so that if you have liquid, it can just go on through the stomach into the duodenum and we don't have to wait for it. If there's stomach in there, it closes really tightly so that we don't have that opening. That's what it looks like. It looks pretty great. Gastric volume, increased volume increases the rate of emptying. So it's not due to pressure changes because your stomach has Rugy. It is a local myenteric reflex, which just means the stronger the contraction, the stronger, the stronger the dilation of the muscle or stretch of the muscle, the stronger the contraction. So the more the wall is stretched, the stronger the pyloric pump. It's probably enhanced by gastrin because gastrin enhances all muscular movements of the stomach, and it also inhibits the pylorus so that it can relax and allow food to empty. So here somebody just had 10 mils in the stomach, so intragastric, 10 mils. The emptying rate is about 1 mil a minute. So that's a pretty slow little rate, about 10% per minute if you put it in fractions. All right. If here there was a large meal or a large amount of fluid, so 250 mils is in the stomach, and now we see that the emptying rate is 38 mils per minute. So that's a 15% fractional rate. So the more there is in there, the faster it empties. I study alcohol, and people notice how much they urinate when they drink, and that's because you're putting a lot of fluid in there. So if you have 6 beers, your stomach's now full of liquid. So then it's going to cause emptying. And chances are you probably had some more, and more is being absorbed, or fluids being absorbed. So the urination happens more frequently because you've just preloaded on alcohol. What inhibits stomach emptying? One is food in the duodenum. If there's food in there, then, whoops, not rat. We don't have a rat down there. That'd be crazy, like Mr. Lemmy Winks. If there's food in the duodenum, your body's not going to send any more there, hopefully. So if the load is too heavy, the stretch signals to the stomach to decrease the rate of emptying so that the body can absorb all the goodness from what's in the duodenum. Those reflexes to inhibit it are mediated by the enteric nervous system, the sympathetic ganglia, because we know sympathetic is inhibitory, and the vagus nerve to the brainstem can inhibit normal excitatory messages from the vagus. So all reflexes inhibit the pyloric pump and increase the tone of the pylorus so that the stomach does not empty. And what you see here is a nice little graph showing you the different things that can stimulate a increase or decrease of contractile force. So I'll let you go through that on your own because we're getting towards the end. So some other things that are monitored in the duodenum. So we already said load can affect what's going on with the stomach. There's also a ton of chemoreceptor cells in the duodenum. So we have stretch, that was the first thing. So distension of the duodenum that tells the stomach what to do, if it could continue to empty or limit emptying. If the mucosa of the duodenum is irritated. So if that person has gastroenteritis, for example, that might cause some changes to the rate of the stomach emptying. So when there's a lot of irritation, typically you don't have fast movement of things into the intestines, because once they're there, they're going to go really quickly. The acidity of the chyme. Remember, the stomach's pH should be 1.5 to 3. If it's below 3.5 to 4, then there's an inhibitory message sent forward to prevent further emptying by the stomach until the pancreas produces enough bicarbonate to neutralize the chyme that's in there. If it's a higher pH, it can move by faster. What I was going to say about that, why I stop for a second, is when people take Tums or other things like bicarbonate, those signals that are monitored here in the duodenum, they signal to the cells that make acid, and they essentially tell them, like, if you had a pH of 7 down there, these cells would say, wow, that's really bizarre, you should make more acid. So that encourages more acid production. So even though those antacids make you feel better in the short term, it causes something called rebound reflux. And whenever you see the term rebound, it means that it's worse now than it was before. So when you take Tums, you'll actually make more acid later, and that hurts. The osmolality of the chyme, so how many osmoles, so osmoles are things that effectively move water. So if they're hyper or hypotonic products, those can slow emptying so you don't alter the electrolyte balance in the body. And then we've already said proteins and fats, those are monitored by the duodenum. And the more protein and fats there are, the slower the stomach empties, because we want to really digest and then break down those products so we can absorb them. All right, moving on. So now we're in the small intestine, and the small intestine engages in a propulsatory movement of peristalsis. But there's also these mixing movements too. So segmentation, here's some nice regularly spaced segmentation. There can be slow segmentation, like just one ring of constriction. There can be irregularly spaced segmentation. Here's some really weak ones, and you see that a lot in like low, high fiber diets actually. But these mixing contractions are called segmentation. And again, they're just signaled by stretch. So distension in the small intestine, you get more contractions. The slow wave potential is what generates these. They're just normal mixing, like weak mixing movements of the stomach. About 12 per minute happen when you give atropine, which is an acetylcholine antagonist, so it would block the parasympathetic nervous system. Those weaken the contractions of the small intestine. So that means that the slow wave is important, but we also need the myenteric plexus to work together with the parasympathetic nervous system. So those are your mixing, segmentation, and propulsive is just peristalsis. So we have our contraction wave and preceded by the dilation or relaxation of the circular muscle. Everything, remember, is polarized towards the anus. So peristalsis happens in one direction. It goes this way and it doesn't go back. These propulsive movements can be initiated at any point. So here we see food slowly moving, 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 and it moves about 0.5 to 2 centimeters a second. They're generally pretty weak and die out after 3 to 5 centimeters. Chyme moves really slowly through the small intestine. 3 to 5 hours are needed to go from the pylorus to the end of the small intestine, which is the ileocecal valve, unless there is peristaltic rush. In peristaltic rush, there is one wave of contraction that starts at the top of the small intestine, and it contracts that whole 11-foot coil of small intestines all at once. And that's what you see in things like gastroenteritis, or what people call the stomach flu, where there's very intense diarrhea. Control of peristalsis. Peristaltic activity is increased after a meal. That tells you the duodenal wall stretch is important. There's a gastroenteric reflex, which is initiated by stomach distension, meaning, so gastro is stomach, enteric is small intestines. So once food moves into the stomach, then peristalsis typically begins. There's hormones that we will talk more about in the next chapter. Trust me, there's so many of them. We know gastrin increases motility. It increases everything, stomach and churning and peristaltic related. And then we have some other things like CCK, which is going to interact with the gallbladder, insulin, which is triggered by glucose in the bloodstream. Motilin is just what it sounds like. It encourages motility. And serotonin is a vasodilator, meaning it's a breakdown product of food, and it helps bring more blood flow to the areas that are active. Okay, so once you're in the small intestine, then you have to get to the large intestine. And the ileocecal valve, which connects the ileum, so the final point of the small intestine, to the cecum, the lowest point of the colon. And once things are in the colon, they don't go back. The ileocecal valve is one way. And I'll put a video up there for you so you can watch what that looks like when food moves from the small intestine to the large intestine. So we've got the colon, and the colon, we can tell we're in there because there's these ring-like constrictions in the wall. That's named for the person who found them. They're usually called Haustral or Haustra, who's a dude, obviously. And then we see that there's no villi, so we know we're not in the small intestine. So it's just round, it just makes mucus, and this part of the body can absorb water, but it's mainly the small intestine's job to do that. So here's the ileum going into the cecum, and the ileocecal valve is the valve that controls that movement. So the ileocecal valve prevents backflow. It goes into the lumen or the lining of the colon, so it's right on the inside. When the cecal contents, so if there's any stool in here, if this is too high, it stays really tightly closed, but typically it's just in a mild state of constriction, so that the ileal contents empty into the cecum pretty slowly. But the longer food stays in the ileum, which is the absorptive part, the small intestine, the better things are absorbed. So more fluid in the small intestines promotes emptying. That's because of the defecation response. The more water there is and the more stretch there is, so there's faster peristaltic activity. If there's pressure, chemical irritation, you get a relaxing of the ileocecal valve and more peristalsis. If there's pressure or chemical irritation in the cecum, you inhibit peristalsis. So if there was an infection here, an irritable bowel disease, things of that nature, you get impaired emptying. Okay. Some different movements. We have the gastroileal reflex, which is kind of stomach to the ileum. When the cecum is distended, again, contraction of ileocecal valve, and we don't have ileoperistalsis. Again, irritation there in the case of an infection or just too much bacteria making gas. The cecum empties into the appendix, so the appendix most commonly becomes inflamed when fecal material enter it. When the appendix gets large and inflamed in appendicitis, the sphincter spasms. It essentially paralyzes the ileum so that we don't have any further movement of food. And if you've talked to somebody who's had appendicitis or maybe had it removed, they lose quite a bit of weight beforehand because you have inhibition of emptying, which means the body doesn't drive caloric seeking because you can't handle any more load in the GI tract. This gastroileal reflex, that's mediated by the myenteric plexus and also the sympathetic nervous system because that is an inhibitory movement and sympathetic inhibits. So here is the colon. Again, here's our ileum. So here's the cecum with the appendix off of it. Pretty easy names here. Ascending colon. So the ascending colon is on the right side. So I want you to remember lower right quadrant pain is appendicitis pain. So this is your right side. You have to picture this as a patient lying on a table. So this is their right. So ascending colon, right hepatic flexure because the liver is around here. Transverse colon goes across. Left splenic flexure, so around the spleen. And then we have the descending colon. This final portion here is the sigmoid colon because it's S-shaped. And then there's a pretty steep movement from the sigmoid into the rectum, which helps slow the transit of bowel contents into the rectum. All right, so the principal job of this colon is to absorb extra water and really just store food so that it can be excreted. It can absorb some electrolytes also. And then, yeah, it can just store food. Things can stay in there for like 24 hours and even longer, and it's probably fine. It just becomes more malodorous and difficult to pass the longer it stays in because then more water is extracted. The proximal half, so the first half of the colon, is mainly absorption of water and its products. The distal half is really just storage. Things move through the colon really slowly, very, very slowly. You also see these nice names. So things enter as fluid, then the water gets sucked out, so it's semi-fluid, and then here we're in the first part still, so it's kind of mushy, and then up until it gets to the splenic flexure, it's like semi-mush, and then by the time it gets to the sigmoid, it's semi-solid, and then finally solid when it gets to the rectum. Okay, two types of movement. So there is the propulsive movement. It's called haustral shuttling. And then there's mass movements. And mass movements are the big activities to move food or fecal contents out so it can be excreted. So these haustrations, those are your mixing movements. Haustra is the name of the guy who discovered these little coils of muscle, and these ring-like pieces of muscle were named haustra. And whenever they contract so strongly that they actually dilate the loops around them. So here you see a colon, and the black stuff is fecal contents, and it's moving through the colon. So this will correspond typically with 3 meals a day, and there's usually 3 strong mass movements a day. But haustral movements, these mixing movements, they're just slow and they move things very, very short distances. So they're large circular constrictions, 2 centimeters of circular muscle contract almost to the point where you can't see the lumen anymore. So the entire lumen is occluded pretty much. Peaks at 30 seconds, dies out at 60. So long, long contraction, long relaxation, and slow movements. 8 to 15 hours to make it through the entire colon. So we pretty much about a day just in the GI tract. In the colon, longitudinal muscle contracts at the same time. Again, in every part of the body that happens, and circular then contracts so much that we get unstimulated portions bulging out. So you'll see that here. See that little guy? It looks like a marshmallow. That's called a haustration because it turns into a sac. It's kind of like squeezing a balloon where the air goes into the part you're not squeezing. That's what the colon do when the parts next to it become contracted. Okay, so that's just your haustral shuttling or haustrations. That's your mixing and just, movement. And then the mass movements are long or more vigorous times of shuttling, essentially, through the colon. These start in the cecum and move towards the sigmoid, meaning you got to move this one, which means you also have to move this one. And then you have to make room by moving this one. So everything is going to move forward. These usually occur 1 to 3 times a day, depending on how many times that person ate and what their meals included. The most common time for somebody to have a mass movement is about 15 minutes during the first hour after breakfast, because that's when the stomach contents start to empty into the duodenum, which means that the colon now has to make room for the new food. Modified peristalsis, so it's a constricted ring in the distended part, usually the transverse, and the next 20 centimeters they lose their rings so that we push all of that about 20 centimeters and everything moves forward in one big wave. Force builds up for 30 seconds, relaxes for 2 to 3 minutes, and then another one starts further down the colon. And the series of a mass movement usually last about 10 to 30 minutes, and then the colon is done until the next time that person eats. So this is signaled by this gastroenteric or colic reflex. Gastro for stomach, colic for colon. So food leaves stomach, colon has to make room, so it engages in mass movements. The other thing that can cause mass movements is just irritation. UC is ulcerative colitis. So when people eat in that disease, like anything really, that causes mass movements to occur. Okay, final reflex is just defecation. So this is very simple. So the sigmoid is there, again, to provide slowing of things into the rectum. If it's nice, solid fecal material, it should go really slowly down into the rectum and then not really stretch the rectum much. But if it's watery, like in diarrhea, it will be a huge amount of stretch, and that will send a message up to the cord and then to the brain, hopefully, and say that we have to go really quickly. So it increases urge. So the rectum is generally empty. It's filled when a mass movement eventually moves the fecal material that's prepared there. That angle, it's almost 90 degrees, that helps add resistance. The sphincter is really weak, and when feces get into the rectum, there's an urge to go to empty the rectum. And those stretch receptors here, these sensory receptors, when they feel stretch, they send a message up to the cord, which sends a message down to the internal sphincter to prepare for defecation. There's 2 sphincters. There's the internal. So the internal one is automatic. So that one is affected by the cord, the spinal cord. And then the external anal sphincter is the one that we have conscious control over. And that is skeletal muscle. It's innervated by the pudendal. So that's the sphincter that the person has to put their focus on when they choose to defecate. All right, so here, descending colon, we've got these afferent nerve fibers, so they're sending, they're receiving information, and we've got these motor nerves that are coming from the cord to affect what the sphincters are doing. So when the feces get to the rectum becomes stretched. The afferents through the myenteric plexus increase waves in the colon, the sigmoid, and rectum. The internal sphincters relax by inhibitory signals. So when there is filling, when there's stretch here, it sends a message to the cord. There's stretch, the rectum is full, and that nerve coming from there, the motor nerve, that will loosen or relax the internal sphincter so that the feces are now primed, and the only thing holding them there is that person's conscious control by keeping the external sphincter contracted. When the person moves to a place that it's convenient to defecate, they have to relax their external sphincter so that defecation can take place. In sympathetic and parasympathetic talks, when somebody gets really scared and sympathetic, this is interrupted, this process, by stress, by sympathetic discharge. So sometimes people can poop themselves unintentionally. Parasympathetic reflex, those are the sacral segments, so S2, 3, 4, nerve endings stimulated in rectum. Those signals go to the cord and then out to the colon, sigmoid, rectum, and anus by those pelvic nerves, increase peristalsis, relax the internal sphincter, and they just work along with the local reflex. So the colon can be completely emptied when this is initiated. So here is the full defecation reflex. You can activate that on purpose by taking a deep breath and contracting the diaphragm and the ab muscles. That's called the bear down response. But again, we have feces move down to the rectum. We get this stretch response, sends down a message to relax the internal sphincter. But at the same time, we can have conscious control go up and tell the brain that you have to make a choice about whether or not there's defecation. If there's a small amount of stretch, the urge is low, meaning that somebody can wait. If there's a huge amount of stretch, like in diarrhea, and there's a liter of water there, there's not a lot of choice. Urge is going to be very strong. So the stronger the stretch, stronger the urgency. And now we've made it all the way through. So sample board question, hopefully you guys can answer that. I won't answer it for you because I want you to think about it. All right, I will see you soon.